Welcome to the Spot On Insurance Podcast, brought to you by Insurance Licensing Services of America, ILSA. This is Ted Tavares.
And this is Arlene Tavares coming to you from beautiful Puerto Rico. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at a topic that affects every single one of us.
But before we get started, don't forget to click on the subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. And now here's our host, Doug Foresta.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. My guest today is Paul Smith, and we're going to be talking about selling with a story. Let me say a little bit about Paul, and then I'll bring him right on. Paul Smith is one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling. He's a keynote speaker, storytelling coach, and author of the book Sell with a Story, Parenting with a Story, and the best-selling Lead with a Story, which is already in its 8th printing and available in 6 languages around the world. He's a former consultant at Accenture, former executive and 20-year veteran of the Procter Gamble company. And you can learn more about him at leadwithastory.com. That's leadwithastory.com. We'll repeat that again at the end. Paul Smith, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So, yeah, let's talk about, today I know we're going to talk about the connection between storytelling and selling. And my first question for you is, can you explain, you talk about a sales story. Can you explain what a sales story is?
Yeah, so I think that word story has been used and misused quite a bit in the last couple of decades. I would say, when you and I were little, if somebody asked you to tell them a story, or you'd know exactly what they meant. That would mean, and now little kids don't use the word narrative, but it would be a narrative about something that happened to somebody. That's what a story is. But these days, people use the word story for, if you gave a great speech, or you wrote a great memo, or did a wonderful analysis, or had a really good presentation, or you wrote a good mission statement. People use the word story for all of that stuff now. Mission statement's a great story, And the truth is, none of those things are stories. Those are great emails and memos and things like that, but they're not really stories. A story is something very special. Like not every set of words that has meaning is poetry. A poem is something special. So a real story has a time and a place and a main character, and that main character has a goal, and there's usually some obstacle or villain getting in the way of that goal, and there are events that transpire that hopefully wrap themselves up nicely in the end with either the hero or the main character achieving their goal or not achieving their goal. That's what a story is. A story is not a list. Here are the 3 reasons why you need to buy my product. That's not a story. That's a sales pitch. And so they're very different things. So when I say a story, I mean a real story about something that happened to somebody. And when I say a sales story, I mean any story that's used in the process of either making a sale or maintaining a customer.
So that dovetails nicely into my next question for you, which is, could you explain that difference between a sales pitch, what a sales pitch would sound like, versus a story? Do you have an example, perhaps, of what the difference would be like?
Let me start with a story. I'll give you a story, and then we'll talk about what, if I wanted to turn that into a sales pitch, what would that sound like? So the actual sales stories, here's one that just happened to me a couple of summers ago. My wife and I were at an art fair, and she was looking for some art for our kids' bathrooms at home. And so we get to this one booth of this underwater photographer, a guy named Chris Goog, and he just does these mesmerizing pictures of underwater life, like sea anemones and coral reefs and stuff like that. And my wife's looking through his wares there, and she gets emotionally attached to this one picture that to me looked about as out of place as a pig in the ocean. Because, Doug, it was literally a picture of a pig in the ocean, okay? Which, of course, made no sense to me whatsoever. And pigs don't swim, and they don't generally hang out in the ocean, and, So as soon as I got a chance to interrupt, I asked the guy, I said, what's up with the pig in the ocean? And that's when the magic started. The guy said, oh, yeah, it was the craziest thing. He said, that picture was taken off the coast of this uninhabited island in the Bahamas called Big Major Cay. And he said, apparently what happened was a few years before that, some local entrepreneur decided to raise a pig farm for bacon, I guess. And he put all these pigs out there because he found this free, uninhabited island where he could just keep all these pigs at. Well, he didn't plan very well because he realized not long after that there's not much on the island other than cactus for these pigs to eat. And apparently pigs don't like cactus. So they literally weren't eating and weren't thriving. Well, they got lucky in that they noticed that every night a local restaurant owner from a neighboring island would boat his kitchen refuse over to Big Major K and dump it offshore, right, just to get rid of it. Now, pretty soon these pigs are hungry enough, they smell this food, and they get hungry enough that they brave the ocean waters and figure out how to dog paddle or piggy paddle or something their way out to get this food. And every night this happens, and these pigs are hungry enough that one pig learns, two pig learns, 3 generations later, all the pigs on Big Major K can swim. And he said that made it so easy, by the way, for me to get this picture. I just had to boat up to this island. I didn't even have to get my scuba gear on. Whenever they see a boat coming, they think they're going to get fed. So they swim right up to the boat, So anyway, by the time we got to that point in the story, I already had my credit card out and I'm like, we'll take it, right? And why? I mean, think about that. 2 minutes ago, that picture was worth nothing to me. I mean, not even the paper it was printed on. It was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But 2 minutes later, it was worth exponentially more, right? Because now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. A story that I can tell anytime, somebody comes to my house and goes to the bathroom. I get to tell it to you right now. I love telling that story. And it was this history lesson and geography lesson and animal psychology lesson all rolled into one, right? So that story literally made the picture worth more to me, the buyer. And so that's an example of a sales story, not a sales pitch. In fact, when I talked to him about that later, I said, that story is what sold me on that picture. He goes, yeah, well, that's not really why I told it to you. I wasn't trying to sell it to you. So I know that makes it even better. It worked anyway. But imagine if he wanted to give me a sales pitch. Here's what that would have sounded like. It would have been, well, there are 3 reasons why you got to buy this picture, right? First of all, it's the right color palette to fit in your bathroom with the towels that you've got there already. Secondly, it's the right size, and thirdly, it's in the right price range, or maybe he'd add a fourth one that, it's the right combination of adultish, ness for your 17-year-old, but still playful enough for your 12-year-old. And I mean, that would have been a sales pitch. It would have been a logical, rational list of the reasons why I needed to buy that product. And there's nothing wrong with a sales pitch. I mean, if you're going to sell something, you generally need to have a sales pitch. But a sales pitch is not a sales story. And he had far more success telling me the sales story than he ever would have had telling me the sales pitch, because there were probably dozens of pictures at that art fair, in his booth and other people's booths, that would have met most of those criteria. But his was the only one that had that story.
I'm thinking about that in terms of obviously for agents, producers, brokers, for insurance. And, I could see how that would be so powerful to lead with a story, sell with a story. Why do you think that stories are so effective in the sales process?
Yeah, well, a lot of reasons. The top 2 or 3, I guess, would be, first of all, stories speak to the part of the brain where we make decisions, right? A lot of the cognitive science that's been done in the last couple of decades tells us that human beings make subconscious, emotional, sometimes irrational decisions in one place in their brain. And then a few nanoseconds later, we justify those decisions logically and rationally in some other place in our brain. So if you really want to influence people's thinking and behavior and decisions, which you have to do when you're in sales, it turns out you really need to influence them emotionally and subconsciously. And lists, in other words, sales pitches, just don't do that. They only speak to half of the brain. If you want to speak to the other half, you need a story. But at least one other reason is that stories just make things easier to remember. Right? I mean, a number of studies show that facts are between 6 and 22 times more likely to be remembered if they're embedded in a story than if they're just given to people in a list. And you can prove that to yourself right now. Like I'm in the middle of giving you a list of 3 or 4 things. Nobody listening to this is going to remember that list of 3 or 4 things this time tomorrow. But you will remember the story of the pig in the ocean. That's one of the benefits of storytelling. It really does that.
Spot on Insurance is sponsored by ILSA, Insurance Licensing Services of America, America's premier insurance licensing experts. To learn more about ILSA and the services they provide, visit ilsainc.com. What do you think separates a great sales story from simply a good or average or even a boring one?
Yeah, so I guess as long as it's got those things that I said earlier, it'll be at least a story. So the time, the place, the character, the goal, the obstacle, things like that. But you're right, that doesn't make it a great story. What separates the great stories from the average or boring ones are things like having the right story structure, having an emotional component, a surprise ending is a critical component of a powerful story. So those are the type of things. I basically have a chapter in the book on each of those components to take a story from good to great.
Can you share some tips? I know one of the things people struggle with too is how to choose the right story to tell, if you're with a client. And so can you share some tips about how to choose the right story, and then also how to determine, when is the right time to tell that story to someone? Yeah.
So let me do that. The tip that I would start with is that structure. So, and that's very important in storytelling. And to get the structure right, the easiest way to think about that is that your story needs to answer 8 questions for your audience, and it needs to answer them in this order. So here are the 8 questions. 1, why should I listen to this story? Right? If you don't answer that question up front, your audience may not listen to you. They might either mentally, emotionally, or physically check out, right? Walk away. So you got to answer that first. Then you've got to answer the rest of these questions in this order. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right? Those are the kind of the natural questions a human being wants to hear in a story to understand it effectively. And then, if you're counting, that's not 8 yet. So the final 2 after the story is, what did you learn from it? And what do you think I should do about that? In other words, what do you recommend? What's your recommendation, right? So if you answer those 8 questions in that order, you'll almost certainly have a decent story. If you don't answer all those 8 questions, or you answer them in the wrong order, you're almost guaranteed to confuse your audience. So that's the big thing, is get the questions right. But as far as knowing which stories to tell or how to find those right stories, I always say start with the end in mind, right? What do you want your audience to think, feel, or do after hearing your story? And then once you know what that is, then there are 3 places to look for the story. Think of a relevant success or a failure or a moment of clarity around that thing, right? So a time you've seen that thing done well, a time you've seen it done very poorly, those will both make great stories, or the time you learned that lesson the first time yourself. Because if it made such a big impact on you when it happened, it'll make a great impact on other people as well when you tell it to them in the form of a story.
Thank you. And, one of the things too, I'm thinking again about the insurance industry, and there's a lot of data. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'm wondering about is it possible to tell interesting stories with data and numbers? And if so, could you share an example of how that would be done? Yeah, so I think it is possible. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but there's a couple of pretty good techniques. One of which I'll share with you now, and I call that the discovery journey story method with data. That's kind of a mouthful, but I think you'll understand it. So most people would tell you, if you're going to you've done a bunch of analysis, you've got all this data, you're going to make a recommendation to somebody, that you tell them the recommendation, and then you use the data to explain why that's your recommendation. And you usually walk them through all the analysis that you did, even the irrelevant stuff. That's just kind of how we do things. But the way to tell that in a story form is telling a story about you when you were analyzing that data and came up with this aha moment where the analysis made sense to you. And so the way you do that is you say, well, look, I was investigating this problem or this hypothesis or trying to answer this question for a client of mine. So I pulled this data and I looked at it. And this part wasn't helpful and this part wasn't helpful. And I looked at this and I struggled to find this. But then I came across this particular piece of data and I analyzed it this way. And that's when everything started to make sense. And then show them that particular piece of data, that chart or that graph or whatever that one thing is, that silver bullet. And then stop right there and ask them, what would you make of this if you'd come across this like I did? Because probably your audience is smart just like you, right? And so you've kind of led them down this path to see this wonderful data that you've uncovered. Let them determine what that means. Because as you know, people are far more passionate about their own ideas than they are about your ideas. And when you tell the story this way, the path that you went down in discovering this thing and then stop at the moment of discovery or just prior to it, you give them the gift of discovery. And then they get to have that aha moment in their gut. And then from then on, that will be their idea, not your idea. And they're just far more likely to act on it. Right. And then you can finish the story. If they don't get it right, then you can tell them, well, here's what I concluded from that. But 9 times out of 10, they'll come to the same conclusion. And that's the best outcome of all. Thank you. That's brilliant. I love that. My last question for you is, some people seem to be just natural storytellers, and, from birth, they're always, they're just able to tell stories. But how about for people where storytelling maybe doesn't come naturally to them? Is it your experience? Can people learn storytelling? Is it something that you can get better at?
Yeah, it definitely is. And that's one of the bigger surprises that I think people in my training classes think. They assume that there are people that are great at storytelling and people that aren't. And if you're just not born with it, you're never going to be good at it. And I think the analogy I use is it's a bit like being a musician or an artist. Obviously, there are some people who are just naturally born and gifted musicians and artists, and others of us, like me, who are not on either of those fronts. But I'll bet if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, I probably could learn. What I would do is I would buy a guitar, and then I would go hire a guitar instructor. And I would take lessons for like 6 months or something. And then I would practice every day. I mean, that's how you learn something that you're not naturally good at. Storytelling is exactly the same way. The problem is most people don't realize that it's a learnable skill, like playing the guitar or learning marketing or whatever. So once you recognize that, then go read a book on the topic, go take a training class on the topic, learn from somebody who does it well. But absolutely, it is a learnable skill. But you're not going to learn it by just saying, well, I just need to get more comfortable telling stories, so I'm just going to start telling more stories. Well, fine, but that's like saying I'm just going to learn to play the guitar or the piano by just banging out on the keys, right? I mean, it's going to take a long time to get good at it that way. You're far better served by learning from a pro.
That's great. As you said that, I think of the thing about, how many monkeys would it take to type on a typewriter to eventually make Hamlet?
Exactly. It'd take a long time. Yeah, there's a better way.
So for people who are listening to this and saying, you know what, I really do want to become better at storytelling, I would like to learn more about this. How can they learn more about you and, of course, learn more about storytelling?
Yeah, so great. The quickest place to go is just my website, which is leadwithastory.com. You can find out about all the training courses I do and the books. And the one that we've talked about most today, Sell with a Story, if you get that, it lays out the 25 types of sales stories that most salespeople need to be able to tell. And what I found is that most of them have about 5 of those. There's a lot more that you need. And it'll also teach you how to do those. But that's a good place to start with learning what's the set of sales stories that I need to have in my repertoire. And then the rest of the book is how do I tell them.
My guest has been Paul Smith. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your words of wisdom with us.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
By the way, our show notes and bonus resources can be found on spotoninsurance.com. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single episode.
Thanks for joining us. And don't forget, we'll be answering this week's podcast questions at Spot On Insurance Facebook Live, Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern.